Welcome to this 18th Annual Lecture of the History Council of Victoria. I'm Peter McPhee, Chair of the Board of the History Council. The first thing I want to do is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today. The History Council of Victoria recognises the long history and significant cultural heritage of the traditional owners. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Our presenting team today will be speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri, but also the Boonwurrung and the Wadawurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations peoples. We have more than 400 registrations for this evening's special event. We're delighted to welcome all of you across Victoria, across Australia, and overseas. Let me give you a few writing instructions for this webinar. Of course, we're recording the webinar and we'll make that recording available soon. You'll only see the presenters during the course of it. If you have questions that you want to pose to this evening's lecturer, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If a presenter's internet connection is slow or disrupted, they'll continue just with their sound. Of course, we're welcoming your questions and you'll keep them polite and respectful, I know. Use the chat button if you have particular technical issues or if you want to express your appreciation. Let me say something briefly now about the History Council and its work. The History Council of Victoria is the peak body for history in Victoria. Our vision is to connect Victorians with history and to inspire engagement with the past. We champion the work of historians and the value of history about any place and about any period. The History Council was formed in 2001, so this is our 20th birthday. Its board comprises representatives from cultural and educational institutions and heritage bodies, history teachers from history programs across the state, academic and professional historians, and Indigenous community and specialist history organisations. Among our roles are advocacy and representation to government and the wider community, networking with allied history groups, and community education, particularly our Making Public Histories program, which we run along with our partners at the Old Treasury Building and at Monash University, and the History Council Roadshow, which is a particularly important activity linking the work of specialist historians with the studies of VCE students across the state. We've been busy presenting video lectures and live Q&A sessions over the last few weeks. I want now to introduce Professor David Lowe. David joined the History Council of Victoria in 2020, representing Deakin University, and he became Deputy Chair of our board last year. David is Chair of Contemporary History in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin and a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. He's published widely on the history of Australia and on international history and memory. In 2015, he was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. David is co-founder of the Australian Policy and History Network and was visiting professor in Australian Studies at the University of Tokyo in 2019 and 20. I invite David to introduce our lecturer, Dr. Carolyn Holbrook. David.
Thanks very much, Peter, and might I also add my welcome to the many attendees this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Carolyn Holbrook to you. Carolyn is an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award Fellow, and she's also a senior lecturer at Deakin. She's currently researching a history of how Australians have regarded their federation since 1901. Previously, she's written about how we remember the First World War in her book Anzac, the Unauthorised Biography, published in 2014, which was winner of the New South Wales Premier's History and Queensland History Book Awards. And she's also explored remembering the First World War in another book, The Great War, Aftermath and Commemoration, published in 2019, edited with Keir Reeves. With James Walter, Carolyn is writing a history at the moment of political decision-making in Australia. And with colleagues at Deakin and Warwick University, she's also researching the history of public health care, including Medicare in Australia. It's a great pleasure now for me to invite Carolyn to deliver the History Council of Victoria Annual Lecture with the nicely provocative title, I Don't Hold a Hose, Mate, Power and Sentiment in the Australian Federation. Carolyn.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully that's looking okay and you can all see my first slide. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous country from where I am talking. I'm in the Bayside area of Melbourne, where Indigenous societies were very rapidly disrupted by the arrival of Europeans in the 1830s, and much of the history of those societies has tragically been lost. I pay my respects to the owners of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners. Thank you to the History Council of Victoria for the honour of presenting its 18th annual lecture and all the work you have done to organise tonight's event. In particular, I would like to thank Alicia Soretto, Peter McPhee and David Lowe for all your hard work. Thank you also for all the people who've registered, to Melburnians who've opted to come along and listen to this just before we bust out of our world's longest lockdown. Any people in Western Australia, my family who might be listening, people all around Australia and people anywhere else in the world, thank you for coming along. So in the spirit of the History Council's goal of sharing historical knowledge more widely in the community, I want to talk tonight about an abstract, often ignored phenomenon, but one that has been garnering a lot of attention lately, the Australian Federation. Now, this burst of attention actually began before the COVID pandemic in late 2019, when the Prime Minister was criticised for holidaying in Hawaii while huge areas of the country burned. In announcing during an interview on 2GB radio that he was returning to Australia, Morrison was defiant. I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room, he told host John Stanley. I think Morrison was probably making a comment about federalism. Emergency services are a state responsibility. But his comment was interpreted as displaying a stunning lack of leadership and compassion. Social media, the opiate of the partisans, went nuts, and a petition with 70,000 signatures that called for Morrison to be sacked was sent to the Governor-General. So in the wake of the hose controversy, the COVID pandemic has well and truly brought our federal system of government out from the shadows of officialdom and into the spotlight of everyday life. Border closures, shop closures, public health orders, quarantine breaches, vaccine delays, opening up too quickly, opening up too slowly. It has been a perfect storm of uncooperative federalism that has shot the premiers to a prominence they have not enjoyed for quite some time. The changing dynamics of the Federation have elicited bold commentary. Having declared the premiers more powerful than the Prime Minister in the Financial Review's recent power list, journalist Philip Curry wrote, "The leaders of the four most populous states have, as a collective, challenged and tested the Federation's power structures like never before in peacetime." The finance journalist, Alan Kohler, claimed in September, in the wake of the AUKUS submarine deal, that the federal government runs external affairs while domestically the nation is now a series of fiefdoms run by warlords, in brackets, premiers. He went on, each premier has been handed the gift of status and power, and no one will easily give it back. As a result, the balance of power in Australia's federation has changed in ways that will extend well beyond 2021. Gladys, Stan and Anastasia have become household names, but only in WA has the Premier been accorded cult-like adoration. Mark McGowan's approval rating peaked at 91% in 2021, when he won an extraordinary election victory, which left the Liberal Party with just 2 seats in the lower house. Like Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, the former naval officer is apparently an object of desire. He acted as a muse for Perth comedian Chelsea Jones, who recorded a country music song and video about her fondness for the Premier. As she fondled a life-sized cardboard cutout of McGowan and munched a kebab, Chelsea sang about her knight in shining armour's hard, hard border. I thought the WA Labor Party went too far, however, when it crowned McGowan state dad on Father's Day last month. But that was obviously not too far for many people. Here's a photo of the limb, I think it's probably an arm, of the most recent West Australian to ink the state daddy onto their skin. The extent of McGowan's election victory in March 2021 and his cult status can only be explained by reference to the history of the Federation and how deeply West Australians respond to a leader who twangs the anti-Eastern states heartstring that lurks in the chest of every sandgroper. To illustrate how deeply the federal issue cuts in Western Australia, I want to recall an incident that happened a few years ago when I returned home for a holiday. We were staying at Denmark in the state's southwest when I came across this sign in the window of a fish and chip shop. My husband, who is from Melbourne, remarked with his tongue in his cheek that we West Australians blamed the eastern states for everything. Thinking this was a light-hearted joke, I loaded the photo and Anthony's comment about blaming the eastern states onto Facebook. Well, I was swiftly rebuked by my father and brother. Their comments included hastily Googled statistics about the sweet potato shortage in the eastern states and my need to remove, quote, my eastern states blinkers. Dad ended his comments with some salient points about distribution of the GST, which I had actually heard many times before. So, inspired by COVID and the great sweet potato incident, I want to revisit our federal history in order to demonstrate that the current tensions within the Federation are anything but new. I will argue that alarmist claims about the state of the Federation stem from 2 things. One, we are so used to an all-conquering Commonwealth government that we are shocked to see it being bent to the will of the states. And 2, the usual convergence between the interests of the eastern states and the Commonwealth has been temporarily severed by the COVID pandemic. But I will begin by describing the circumstances in which WA joined the Federation and the unhappy beginnings of what has remained a difficult marriage. So WA almost did not join the Commonwealth of Australia. For 60 years after its settlement by Europeans in 1829, it remained the runt of the Australian colonies. The colony's fortunes were transformed by the discovery of gold in the 1880s and 1890s. The gold rush around Kalgoorlie coincided with depression in the east and drew a huge influx of t'othersiders, which included my paternal great-grandfather, I believe, mainly from Victoria and South Australia. Combined with British arrivals, these t'othersiders saw the state's European population increase 6-fold in the 2 decades following the gold rush. The colony achieved self-government in 1890, several decades later than the other colonies. Among the political class, there was little interest in the push for federation, which had been reignited by Henry Parkes, just as WA achieved self-government. John Forrest was the only prominent West Australian who held any interest in contemplating a closer union. Otherwise, reported another delegate to the 1891 Federal Convention, the feeling against amounts almost to madness. Opposition was strongest among agricultural interests who feared the loss of the colonial tariff and the effect of eastern states' products on an emerging manufacturing sector. A common sentiment among skeptics was that the colony was not yet ripe for federation. During a debate in Bunbury, a local reverend observed that West Australians, quote, looked on federation, excuse me, in the same way as people looked on heaven as a good place to get to, but they wanted to keep out of it as long as they could. It was not until the middle of 1900, by which time an Australian delegation in London was seeking assent to the Constitution Bill, that the colony changed its position. The British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, urged the colony to join the Federation while it could enjoy the temporary protection of Clause 95, which allowed WA to impose a tariff for the first 5 years. In an act that the historian John Lenoes called almost bribery or corruption, Chamberlain implied that he would support the Federalist agitators in the goldfields who were threatening to separate from WA and join the Federation, with Albany as their capital. So a referendum was swiftly held, which showed an overwhelming majority in favour of federation among the T'othersiders in the goldfields. There was a small majority in the Perth area, thanks to the newcomers from the east, and there was a large majority against federation in the traditional agricultural regions of the state. WA suffered almost immediately from buyer's remorse. In 1902, a member of WA's lower house moved a motion for the state to secede from the Federation in protest against the protective tariff, and grievances continued to accrue. There was the delayed construction of the Transcontinental Railway, the unjust effect of the Navigation Act on the outlying states, and in 1906, the expiry of Clause 95, which had allowed WA to continue charging customs duties. In 1906, a state MP, Frederick Munger, introduced a secession bill into the lower house, claiming that, quote, the eastern states have nothing in common with us and no regard for us. His motion proposed that the union of Western Australia with the other states in the Commonwealth of Australia has proved detrimental to the best interests of the state, and that the time has arrived for placing before the people the question of withdrawing from such a union. A state rights league was formed to campaign for secession with branches across the state. The Daily News newspaper ran a survey which invited readers to indicate their support for drafting John Forrest back to state politics by filling out the coupon on the screen. The response was overwhelmingly in favour. In October 1906, the West Australian newspaper advertised an essay competition on the subject of federation. There was a £30 prize on offer for, quote, the best written and most instructive paper setting out the net gains or losses hitherto enjoyed or suffered by this state in the past consequent upon federation, with an estimate of further losses or gains in the early future. All of this talk of losses and gains, of drafting Forrest back to WA and of secession, prompted one of the Federation founders, John Quick, now a member of the Federal Parliament, to intervene. Quick pointed to the preamble to the Constitution, an act of the British Parliament, which combined the colonies into an indissoluble union. He concluded that only the British Parliament possessed the authority to allow a state to leave the Federation. If the government of Western Australia attempted to take possession of the Customs House or the Post Office, which were vested in the Commonwealth, the federal militia would be called out to defend Commonwealth property, Quick explained. That would put an end to the disturbance. So while the collapse of Morrison's national plan for reopening Australia in the time of COVID has certainly raised tensions within the Federation, Scott Morrison has not threatened to surround the Perth GPO with federal troops. Nor is the breakdown of the national plan unprecedented in our federal history. The current situation has very strong parallels with the failure of the so-called November Agreement during the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919. And that's what I want to talk about now, with particular reference again to the experience of Western Australia. So as the Spanish influenza pandemic spread through the Northern Hemisphere in 1918, the greatest danger to Australia was posed by ships carrying troops returning from Europe. During the second week of October 1918, there was a severe outbreak in South Africa and soon after in New Zealand. Using its constitutional power over quarantine, the Commonwealth responded by requiring that ships that had been in contact with South African or New Zealand ports undergo 7 days in quarantine. Though the maritime defence was proving highly effective, the Commonwealth Director of Quarantine, Howard Compston, decided in November 1918 to devise a national plan with the states in the event that the disease did escape quarantine. State ministers of health and officials were invited to confer with the Minister for Trade and Customs, Walter Massey Green, and the Director of Quarantine in Melbourne. The conference produced a 13-point plan of action. Each state agreed to establish an advisory committee, which included the Chief Health Officer and other doctors. They agreed to establish vaccine depots and special hospitals, and to make arrangements for ambulance transport, respirators, and medical and nursing assistance in the event of an outbreak. Massey Green and Compston were sceptical of the value of border quarantine within mainland Australia, except in the case of Western Australia, which was sufficiently isolated for the strategy to have some merit. The premiers insisted, however, that movement be checked as far as possible in the event of an outbreak. Restrictions on travel would buy neighbouring states time to complete their preparations and afford a delay which might reduce the virulence of the disease. Delegates agreed to a clear procedure in the event of the disease breaching quarantine. When a case was recognised, the Chief Health Officer of the state would notify the Director of Quarantine, the Commonwealth Director. The Commonwealth would then proclaim the state to be infected and close its borders with the clean states. Public places such as theatres, music halls, picture shows, race meetings, churches and schools would be closed. Upon the proclamation of a state as infected, the federal government would take complete control of all interstate traffic by land and sea in order to enforce the quarantine. If influenza was discovered in a neighbouring state, the border would be reopened. The power to repeal a proclamation that a state was infected would also rest with the Commonwealth. By late 1918, it appeared that the disaster that had unfolded in South Africa and New Zealand had been averted in Australia. Compston felt confident to pronounce that the period of greatest danger was certainly over. The pandemic that was claiming millions of lives around the world had not penetrated Australia's maritime border. It also looked increasingly likely that the November Agreement would be redundant. In late January 1919, Acting Prime Minister William Watt and state leaders gathered in Melbourne for a scheduled Premiers' Conference. As the Premiers' Conference began, rumours spread of an outbreak of Spanish flu in Melbourne. These reports had been circulating in medical and political circles for a couple of weeks, but had been denied by the Chief Health Officer, Edward Robertson, the 1919 equivalent of Brett Sutton. By the third week of January, the Superintendent of Royal Melbourne Hospital, Ralph McMeekin, had no doubt that the disease affecting an increasing number of his patients was Spanish flu. Growing frustrated by the attitude of health officials, on the evening of the 22nd of January, McGowan announced to the press that there were 27 cases of the disease in the Royal Melbourne Hospital and a good many cases of similar character at the Alfred Hospital. Cumpston and Robertson continued to maintain, both privately and publicly, that the cases were more likely the flu strain that had been circulating in Australia for nearly a year. The next day, the 23rd of January, the Royal Melbourne Hospital admitted 14 new cases and was now treating 40 patients. Others were sent to the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital when the Royal Melbourne ran out of beds. Still, Cumpston and Robertson denied it was Spanish flu. Meanwhile, in Sydney, a returned soldier who had travelled by train from Melbourne on the 21st of January began displaying suspicious symptoms of Spanish flu at No. 4 Military Hospital in Randwick. New South Wales authorities acted swiftly. On the 27th of January, the state declared itself infected, with approximately 20 cases at and connected to the Randwick Military Hospital. Finally, Victoria and the Commonwealth were forced to act. Victoria declared itself affected on the 28th of January, the day after New South Wales. The consequences of Victoria's delayed declaration in collusion with the Commonwealth were quickly apparent. By the time that New South Wales declared itself to be affected, there were 420 cases nationally. 400 of those were in Victoria, of which 35 were fatal. All of the 20 or so cases in New South Wales could be traced to people who had recently arrived from Victoria or their close contacts. So the terms of the national plan, the November agreement, meant that the border between Victoria and New South Wales should remain open because both states were infected. But correctly perceiving that the southern state was more severely infected, New South Wales issued a proclamation under its own Quarantine Act on the 29th of January, which prevented Victorians from entering New South Wales. New South Wales began medically inspecting incoming vessels and imposed 4 days of quarantine in addition to the Commonwealth period of 7 days. Queensland didn't wait for the Commonwealth to act as overseer, as per the terms of the November agreement, before closing its border with New South Wales, leaving thousands of people stranded on either side of the border. Meanwhile, the day before Victoria made an official notification that it was infected, the recently established intercontinental train service had left Melbourne for Western Australia. Fearing that it would bring infected passengers to the west, the acting Premier, Hal Colbatch, instructed his Chief Health Officer, Dr. Everett Atkinson, to quarantine the train in order to ensure that 7 days would elapse before passengers from Victoria disembarked in WA. 2 more trains were held up at Parkston, a town east of Kalgoorlie, so their passengers could be quarantined. Colbatch had intended to accommodate the passengers in tents and marquees provided by military authorities. When strong winds blew down the tents, state officials used the train's dining and sleeping cars to house quarantined staff and passengers. The acting Prime Minister, William Watt, was furious with Colbatch for seizing, as he called it, the transcontinental train. He accused Colbatch and other premiers of breaching the terms of the November agreement and threatened to cancel the agreement, which he did a few days later. Colbatch knew that public opinion in WA was overwhelmingly in his favour. While the federal government maintained such an attitude, Colbatch said, cooperation between the states and the Commonwealth is impossible. The WA press professed outrage at the behaviour of the Commonwealth. The West Australian looked in vain to find among Mr. Watt's communications any expression of reproach to the Victorian Department because of its failure to notify the presence of the disease in their state. The Sunday Times labelled William Watt a jumped up Jack in the office and tin pot tyrant. How long will the West Australian people suffer the intolerable insolence of those elected persons in the East? The paper asked. Secession was again in the air as festering wounds temporarily salved by the unifying effect of the Great War had been reopened. Western Australia had suffered financially while the Commonwealth spent extravagantly and a gang of eastern commercial vultures, aided by their pawns in Parliament, profited enormously, the Fremantle Times wrote. The paper estimated that 95% of West Australians would support secession if a vote were held immediately. The Spanish flu did eventually enter Western Australia in early June 1919, but WA suffered a far lower mortality rate than the eastern states. The episode, in particular the bad faith of the Commonwealth and its clear bias towards Victoria, were further black marks against the Federation for West Australians. In the words of historian Bev Blackwell, it reinforced the proud belief that WA was different from the eastern states. Despite its poor performance during the Spanish flu pandemic, the Commonwealth continued to accrue power during the 1920s, chiefly through its revenue-raising capacity and decisions of the High Court. Several inquiries during the 1920s recognised the disabilities suffered by WA and other less developed states due to the protectionist tariff. In 1925, one of the Royal Commissioners appointed by the federal government to inquire into the disabilities of WA under Federation wrote in his minority report, "In my opinion, Western Australia should never have entered the Federation, but having done so, there is, I feel convinced, only one complete and satisfactory remedy for her present disabilities, viz. Secession." Sir William Lathlane, one-time Lord Mayor of Perth, spoke wistfully about Federation as a witness to that Royal Commission. 25 years ago, we all boarded the good ship Commonwealth for a lifetime voyage with the full assurance that there would be only one class for all passengers. During the voyage, we found to our great surprise that there were 4 classes. Victoria and New South Wales had secured all the saloon cabins, South Australia and Queensland second class. Little Tasmania was put in the steerage, while WA is compelled to work for her passage in the forecastle. In recognition of their innate disadvantage, WA, South Australia and Tasmania began to receive special payments during the 1920s. But when the Depression caused the prices of WA's primary commodities to fall on international markets, resentment in the West increased. The Dominion League was formed in 1930 to take advantage of this rising resentment. It was led by an accountant called Keith Watson, backed by the enthusiastic support of the Sunday Times newspaper, and the Dominion League estimated at one stage to have 10,000 members. Watson ran a highly organised and ultimately successful campaign for a referendum on secession, based on the unfair effect of the federal tariff and the Commonwealth's encroachment into state matters. After an initial attitude of indifference, the Commonwealth became deeply concerned about attitudes in WA. Tasmania and South Australia were following events in WA with great interest, and the fracturing of the Federation loomed as a genuine possibility. Early in March 1933, it was announced that Prime Minister Lyons would lead a federalist speaking tour of WA. The federal guests were not well received. At a meeting at St Majesty's Theatre in Perth, Lyons was heckled and drowned out by the crowd. Coins thrown from the gallery hit Mrs. Lyons, who retired from the stage. Scenes were, quote, unexampled in the recent history of Western Australia, according to a report in the West Australian. There was another rowdy meeting the following day at Fremantle, at which Lyons was counted down and forced to stop speaking. He declared himself disgusted by the behaviour of the crowd. The feeling was mutual. A prominent member of the Dominion League considered that the visit of the federal politicians was worth at least 20,000 votes to the secessionists. When Lyons could be heard above the din of the crowd, he had promised greater consideration of WA's economic discontents. And he played the national security card, emphasising the worrying international environment and the need for WA to enjoy the security offered by its membership of the Federation. The secession vote was held on the same day as the state election in April 1933. 2/3 of electors voted for WA to secede from the Commonwealth. A second proposal for a convention was rejected. In a confounding result, the ruling Conservative Party of Premier James Mitchell, which had supported secession, suffered a massive defeat. The new Labor Premier, Philip Collier, did not support secession, but had promised to implement the will of the people. The government decided to proceed by preparing a petition to the Imperial Parliament to pass legislation allowing WA to secede. A delegation travelled to London in December 1934 to present the petition at Westminster. Increasingly concerned by the turn of events, the Commonwealth began a concerted counter-campaign to keep WA within the Federation. It circulated a booklet called The Case for Union to all WA voters, as well as those in South Australia and Tasmania. Commonwealth ministers and officials lobbied the Imperial Parliament feverishly behind the scenes, arguing that it should not intervene in the Dominion's internal affairs. In May 1935, a joint committee at Westminster announced that the British Parliament would not receive the petition. Keith Watson, one of the delegates in London, retorted that WA now had no option but to resort to force, but he received no support from fellow delegates for this rally to civil war. Premier Collier was very happy to let the matter rest. Improved economic circumstances by the mid-1930s removed some of the sources of discontent, and the worsening international situation pushed WA back towards the security of the national fold. The introduction by the Commonwealth Grants Commission of a new means of calculating grants to the claimant states did much to allay resentment. Instead of trying to calculate disabilities caused by federation, the Commission would allocate funds so that services could be maintained on a so-called Australian level across all the states. The rapid dissolution of the secession movement has formed the basis for some commentators to dismiss it as a quirk of the Great Depression. W.G. McMinn's Constitutional History of Australia, published in 1979, devoted just 2 paragraphs to the secession movement, claiming that the vote to secede is, quote, not necessarily to be taken seriously. Writing in 1990, the Canadian-born law academic Christopher Besant noted the absence of the episode from constitutional texts and casebooks. Besant called this collective forgetting perhaps the most extraordinary legacy of the secessionist movement. I would argue that it is further evidence of the very problem that West Australians rail against, the tendency for the story of Australian federalism to be told by the East, and the related tendency for the interests of Victoria and New South Wales to be conflated with those of the Commonwealth, a phenomenon that works to make the Federation invisible much of the time. So the final episode that I want to cover concerns the 50th anniversary of the Federation in 1951. Like the quiet sidelining of WA's secession bid from our political and constitutional history, it demonstrates the less tangible workings of power within the Federation. Building on plans begun by the previous Chifley government, Prime Minister Menzies saw in what was billed as the Commonwealth Jubilee an opportunity for nation building. The extensive nationwide program of events was framed by the concept of progress. Canberra celebrated Commonwealth Jubilee Week in June 1951, with activities that included a state banquet, a Jubilee ball, military parades, fireworks, and sporting events. The most popular event of the Jubilee was a reenactment of the explorer Charles Sturt's journey up the Murray River, travelling through South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. The busy calendar of sporting events during the Jubilee year included a surf life-saving carnival at Scarborough Beach over Easter in 1951. The Commonwealth granted £2,000 towards the cost of hosting the event in Perth. But the committee that ran Surf Life Saving was dominated by members from New South Wales, and New South Wales did not want to hold the event in Perth. They balked at the distance that they would have to travel and the expense of hauling surf boats and surf skis across the Nullarbor. excuse me, across the Nullarbor. The committee vacillated for several months before reluctantly agreeing to travel to Perth when it looked like the Commonwealth might withdraw its offer of funding. But events immediately turned sour. On the first day of competition, North Cottesloe won the prestigious rescue and resuscitation event after the much fancied DY club was disqualified. DY's patient had apparently failed to touch his buoy marker correctly. The result was a shock to a state that was used to near complete dominance of interstate competitions. New South Wales protested against its disqualification. There were allegations of mistakes by timekeepers who counted that the new type of buoys being used were difficult to see and had been placed further from the shore than they were used to. After an hour of argument on the beach, the referee, a New South Welshman, ordered a rerun of the event. This decision came as a bitter blow to the Cottesloe team, who would have been the first West Australians to ever capture the sought-after title. When the event was rerun, DY retained its title. The historian Ed Jaggard claimed that the North Cottesloe members, quote, were convinced that they had been the victims of a New South Wales conspiracy. Other incidents left a bitter taste in the hosts' mouths. The referee complained that the sun's glare on the water was making conditions difficult for both competitors and officials. They were clearly not used to the sun setting on the ocean, though there was clearly nothing that the hosts could do about that. To make matters worse, the West Australian public showed little interest in the carnival. Organisers had planned for a crowd of 15,000, but achieved less than half of that many over the 2 days of competition. The low gate takings displeased the federal committee, who relied on the income to fund their activities. Somehow it seemed that WA was to blame for everything, wrote Ed Jaggard. While federal politics were mediated in the surf at Scarborough Beach, Western Australian school children were learning their federal history in a special Jubilee booklet issued in 1951. Federation, the path to nationhood and its realisation, described WA's noble self-sacrifice in joining the Federation. John Forrest and those who supported him were fully alive to the disabilities that might result to Western Australia, but they showed statesman-like appreciation of the wider interests and the necessity for consolidating the power of the British Commonwealth in this part of the world, the booklet read. The booklet detailed the problems caused by WA's small population and the concentration of heavy industry in the eastern states. Too often in her history has Western Australia been caused to feel that she was indeed a distant partner. The Nullarbor was more than a plain, it was the barrier which could be overcome only by the best federal impulses and spirit on both sides of it. The pain became overwhelming in the 1930s, but the unifying effect of the Second World War reminded West Australians of the place in their Commonwealth. The text reads, practically midway in the half century, a secessionist movement waxed and waned in Western Australia. It is rarely talked of now because things mightier than financial irritations have been imposed on Australia as a whole, and the impress of a common nationhood has been felt from the Leeuwin to Cape York. In awareness of that nationhood, Western Australia is proudly foremost in the Commonwealth. I think my dad, who would have turned 13 in 1951, must have been reading his special commemorative booklet very closely. So, in conclusion, I want to reflect on what history tells us about the nature of our federal system, what on earth is happening now, and how we might make it work better. Unlike some commentators of late who want to abolish the states, I think that federalism as a form of governance is a pretty good way of allocating power, that is, of determining who holds the hose. Federalism deals well with the tension that can never fully be resolved between governing for the majority and being sensitive to diversity. But by leaving certain powers with the states, federalism invites both national and state loyalties. The trend of federalism since 1901 has been the massive concentration of power in the central government, based on its financial dominance and national security powers. It is no coincidence that the federal government has poured $1 billion over the last decade into that great rhetorical adornment of national security, the Anzac industry. The power of the eastern states has allowed them to dictate the terms of Australian federalism, a dynamic that has allowed those state identities to often become conflated with the national identity. Thus, we saw the strongly expressed view during the bushfires that Scott Morrison should be holding the hose. I have sought to show that as poor cousins of the Federation, Western Australians have not subsumed their state loyalty into a national identity to the extent that the eastern states have. But in activating the health and land use powers that rest with the state governments, the COVID pandemic has pulled some less used federal levers, and it has simultaneously activated state loyalties that were lying dormant. But we are not in danger, as Barnaby Joyce claimed recently, of Queensland getting its own Air Force or WA getting its own Navy. Our Federation's power structures are not being tested like never before in peacetime, as Phil Khoury claimed, nor are the states becoming fiefdoms run by warlord premiers, as Alan Kohler wrote. Our Federation is simply functioning as it was designed. And if Australians don't like it, they need to change the pattern of 120 years and start voting yes to referendums designed to reform the Constitution. Thank you.
Oh, Carolyn, thank you so much for a superb lecture. It was extraordinarily pertinent and rich and sometimes highly amusing. You managed to make our state premiers seem actually quite polite. I was thinking while you were talking of the way in which when the Queensland government in 1919 finally decided to set up a quarantine centre, it sent it as far away from Brisbane just about as possible, 270 kilometres, and right to the New South Wales border. If we have to have quarantine, it'll be, we'll put it as far away and as close to Sydney as we can possibly get. But thank you so much for a lecture which really demonstrated what we at the History Council believe so deeply, and that is the way in which an historical perspective on current issues can be so illuminating, so rich, can give us a real depth of understanding. It was just superb. What I want to do now is to introduce our Executive Officer, Alicia Serretto, who's going to manage the Q&A session for us. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Carolyn. And I want to encourage everyone to ask plenty of questions. And if you haven't been on Zoom enough in the last 2 years, you do that in the bottom menu bar. You click on Q&A and put your question in. You can be anonymous if you wish, and I will pass them through to Carolyn. But we can see lots of great feedback coming through, of course, in the chat for you, Carolyn. And thank you for sharing with us so much around that idea of that constant kind of tug of war of power and status as we look at the states and federal. And it really struck me something that you said to Virginia Trioli this morning on ABC Melbourne, where you said, growing up in Western Australia, you knew you were part of a federation, whereas you felt that maybe in the eastern states, we didn't grow up with that knowledge or way of seeing the world. And can you say a bit more about that for us?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting lesson in the way that power works, and I feel that people who've been doing things in other areas, or there's power obviously in all walks of life, but in other areas where power has all sorts of effects and often devastating effects, to do with things like race and the idea of critical race theory, to try and discern these more subtle workings of power that are different from the big, bold, obvious workings of power. Power can work in subtle ways, and the power of the Australian Federation has a cultural aspect as well, which is what I was hoping to show through talking about the 1951 Jubilee celebrations, the way that the workings of power can be as subtle as New South Wales just refusing to believe that it had lost that rescue and resuscitation race because it always wins. So it sort of just bullies its way into getting the thing rerun. So in Western Australia, because the Federation has been such a source of tension, Western Australians just grow up aware that it exists. In WA, there's a constitutional centre where school kids go to learn about the Federation, but I haven't found any of those kinds of things existing in the eastern states. And like I was trying to explain, I think in the eastern states that the interests of the majority states, New South Wales and Victoria primarily, also Queensland to some extent, coincide in so many big ways with the interests of the Commonwealth that they don't rub against each other as much. So it's easier for people to forget that they live in a federal system. A lot of Australians don't actually even know we live in a federation. There's been polls done on it and it's nearly half the population, I think, probably more right now because of COVID. But yeah, just that. And when I started out on this project on a cultural history of the Federation, the feedback from some colleagues was, you know, what's there to say? Why would you want to do that? Whereas people from the Western Australia would sort of understand it more intuitively.
And there's quite a few people sort of wanting you to do a little predicting of the future for us and to say, you know, how do you see these sort of back to the future dynamics of power in the Federation impact in the next 12 months, but of course the upcoming federal election?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to see what's going on. And I've been looking at the coverage that's been written. I mentioned Phil Curry saying it's this huge shift of power, the biggest since peacetime. Implying that the shifts of power are bigger in wartime. Well, I mean, if they are bigger in wartime, they're always towards the centre. The Commonwealth government has certainly aggrandised itself during both of the world wars. But I think that those kind of claims are overstated. Paul Kelly's also written about it. Greg Cravens is saying that we're reaching sort of crisis time in terms of the future of the Federation. Alan Kohler, Barnaby Joyce. So lots of people making these bold claims that there's some fundamental power shift. But if I look back to 1919 and the Spanish flu outbreak, there are so many similarities, it's just not funny. So the Commonwealth tried to exercise national control to create this national plan. It stuffed it badly because the Prime Minister was acting as the Prime Minister for Victoria. There was clear collusion between the Victorian and the Commonwealth governments, which were both based in Melbourne at that time. So the other states felt incredibly annoyed and bitter about the way that they were treated. So they went out on their own, understandably, closed their borders, all sort of acted against each other in a way that's very similar to what's happened during COVID, states protecting their own interests as you would, because the health and land use powers are with the states. So that was considered a massive error on the part of the Commonwealth, but it did not stop the Commonwealth from its gentle, gradual sort of accumulation of power in the centre. In 1921, Cumpston, the guy I was talking about, established a federal health department, and the whole federal health bureaucracy is built on this incredibly thin constitutional ground of the quarantine power in the Constitution. So the Commonwealth is so powerful in terms of its financial role. People might have heard of vertical fiscal imbalance, the fact that the Commonwealth has so much of the money yet the states deliver the services, that this is a temporary thing during a 1 in 100-year health crisis. And once it passes, I can't see how things won't pretty much return to normal. Some of so this also seems to have a political element. I think it seems to be quite ideological. Some of the people who are calling for the abolition of the states are just annoyed to see the states standing up to the Prime Minister because they're not used to it. But that's how our federation is designed. So it's just what happens. And there's a very strong argument to say that these things are much better handled at the state level the national level, because the state premiers have a much better hand as to what's going on in their states with something like a health pandemic.
And I know, you know, that's how a lot of people have felt in our sort of current day, perhaps, that you know, the state leaders were looking after us in a different way to perhaps the federal government. There's so many questions coming in from the audience here. And one from Joan Beaumont is talking about those sort of border communities. So places like Broken Hill, Albury, Wodonga, Gold Coast, Tweed Heads. Do we know anything about the self-identification of these communities? Do they see them as part of this particular state that perhaps in a way is arbitrary, or how do they look at themselves?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. There was, under that November agreement, there was a certain agreement where people within 10 miles of the border could still commute either side. I just can't remember whether that was discarded by some of the states or not. I know that, for example, with that Queensland border, when that was closed, Queenslanders were just on their way home from Sydney back to Brisbane or wherever, and then they found out during the journey that the border had been closed, and they were just sort of dumped at places like Tenterfield and left to sort of try and find accommodation and stuff. And it was incredibly difficult. And if you look at the press reports, there's all sorts of commentary about these kinds of things. So, I mean, I don't really know the answer to the question, Joanna. It would need further research, or perhaps someone has done it. But I think it's these are always going to be broad brush strokes that always inconvenience people. Border closures are always going to be ridiculously inconvenient and impractical for people who commute for work, or people whose kids go to school the other side of the border. But in terms of those state identities and loyalties as well, I am not sure, and yeah, it's something that would be interesting to have the answer to.
We might even have some people attending tonight who might pop something in the chat if they want to weigh in on that, if they live in those particular areas. We've got a couple of questions here about the economic dimension of this relationship from Graham Davison, who asks about, could you comment on that, especially as how it's been influenced by mineral wealth? And Tim Hogan, who asks similar around those economic conditions. Does it rise and fall depending on where we're at with that?
Yeah, and thanks, Graham. And the economic issues are certainly not my my strength in terms of my knowledge of it. I understand that the function of the protectionist tariff had a disadvantageous effect on the less developed states who hadn't had a chance, they felt, to get their industries established before Federation came, and greatly increased the prices of products that they could import from overseas. So they were reduced to buying expensive, they felt expensive, unproductively produced products from the eastern states. And my dad told me a story recently about a farmer who resented so much having to buy, I think, tractors or ploughs from the eastern states, that he used to buy them from overseas, even though it cost him so much money. So that's a little story of the kind of resentments that built up. So yeah, what happened when the tariff walls were taken down in terms of WA, and also in terms of Western Australia's iron ore boom from the 1960s, and the more recent boom that it's had as well with its exports to China. Well, in the 1960s and 1970s, another big secessionist movement began in the 1960s. I think it was to some extent funded by Lang Hancock, the iron ore billionaire. So it will be interesting when I get up to that stage to try and work out what was behind Lang Hancock's thinking there. I think that at times like that, WA, and now with this current boom, that WA can feel so self-sufficient. Actually, I can hear my dad's words in my head now, that WA earns so much of the wealth of the nation through its mineral exports, and then it gets distributed to all the other states. So, Graham, probably West Australians find another way to feel sort of ripped off by the Federation. And I've got to say, otherwise Dad would be annoyed, GST distribution has been very much an issue for West Australians as well. The fact that they collected so much and got such a low percentage back. And sorry, I can't exactly remember what it was, but it was 30% or something. And then it's been increased of late. But these are issues that will hopefully come more to the fore as I get further on, Graham. But it seems that as that the tariff system came down, there were other economic factors that allowed WA to still sort of put the questions in and come up with the same answers. A lot of discontent with the nature of the federation.
So moving away from the economics of the situation and looking at the cultural elements, and there's a few questions around that. But Claire said, I was wondering if you have any info on how newly arrived migrants, particularly in Western Australia, view the state versus Commonwealth, and also First Nations people for whom borders may even be more of a foreign construct.
Yeah, I mean, there's such great questions. In terms of newly arrived migrants, I don't have any information about current newly arrived migrants, and I imagine they get some kind of education about federalism, but I'm not sure if there's any research out there about that. In terms of migrants and Indigenous people, when I get really stuck into the Commonwealth Jubilee in 1951, I think there's some fabulous material about migrants and about Indigenous people that I can't wait to look at, because you think this is the great post-Second World War migration program. So I think part of the reason the Menzies government jumped on this idea of the 50th anniversary was to put its arms around migrants and sort of bring them into the national project. The theme was progress. The theme wasn't so much on looking back in history, it was very much about the future. So I have a feeling that that was all very much designed with the all the new migrants that were coming from different places, designed with them in mind. And there was a big conference that Harold Holt led in 1951 about migrants as part of the Commonwealth Jubilee. In terms of Indigenous people, there were some fascinating things happening. They were sort of protesting and speaking out in 1951 about the fact that they had been so left out and discarded from the Australian Federation and the Australian nation-making project. There was a big bike ride that was happening all around Australia in 1951, where messages were collected for Robert Menzies. And as part of the messages that were being collected, there were message sticks collected from Indigenous communities. And some of the records of those are held in the National Library. So I'm very keen to get a hold of those and find out more.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's all, there are so many questions here tonight that of course you can't answer them all, but I'm loving all the different directions people are going in. You talked at the beginning of Western Australia's state daddy. It's quite a choice, isn't it? But there's a question here from Helen Penrose, who talks around power now is increasingly around the cult of the individual, and never more I've seen T-shirts with Brett Sutton on it, you know, pillows, all the rest of it, about all of these different state leaders in particular. And Helen asks, did your historical protagonists fill a similar role in the WA community's imagination, or was the public and private divide too pronounced?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I don't think that they would have filled a similar role. No, I don't. The following that Mark McGowan seems to have in WA, where 91% approval rating, and people voting for the Labor Party who've never voted Labor before in their life, there's you know, a few things going on there. One, I'm sure, is to do with that sort of secessionist sentiment that lives in a lot of West Australians. But yeah, a lot of it must also be to do with the sort of the cult of the celebrities, social media, and the emphasis on the individual. And colleagues like Jim Walter have written a lot about this, the demise of the party systems and the institutions of political power and the rise of the individual. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why such an emphasis was put on the fact that Scott Morrison wasn't there to hold the hose in Southeast Australia, mainly, I feel, during the bushfires. I don't think that Western Australians would have had a similar reaction if the bushfires had started early in Western Australia. I don't think West Australians wouldn't have felt so outraged if Scott Morrison was away on holiday because they kind of wouldn't expect him. They'll probably expect Mark McGowan to be holding the hose because of their different attachments. But in terms of people like Hal Colbatch, the acting premier, no, they wouldn't have, because media just wasn't nearly as active as well. So these people just weren't as in your face as they are in this day and age, I think. And a political power team seemed to be more sort of dispersed. Colbatch did eventually become premier very soon afterwards, actually, during this whole crisis. But then his downfall was an industrial dispute with the Wolfies down in Fremantle, and he ended up being premier for just 1 month, which is the shortest term for a state premier in WA ever.
Yeah. And staying with that idea of individuals, Joshua Black wonders if he could ask about the uniqueness of John Curtin as Australia's sole Prime Minister from WA, and how significant was he in helping to secure future allegiance or further allegiance to federation on the part of a state that liked to claim him then and now as their own.
Yeah, because he was born in, I think, Creswick or something in Victoria, of course, and then he went over to WA to take a job on one of the newspapers, and he lived in Cottesloe, just around the corner from some of my relatives who knew the Curtins when they were growing up, a couple of generations above me. Yeah, and you can still see John and Elsie Curtin's house. They were quite friendly, I think. You can still see it there in Cottesloe. So yeah, he was actually a Victorian, but we do sort of claim him, don't we? And I think we nearly got Kim Beazley as Prime Minister. Doesn't look like we'll get Christian Porter. That is interesting, but I'm not sure how much that was a factor as opposed to the Second World War itself. It's interesting, in one of those extracts from the booklet I read out, the 1951 Jubilee booklet from WA, it mentioned the war as such a sort of profound nation-making event. And so West Australians had to put aside their sort of resentments against their mistreatment and just appreciate the fact that they were part of this one nation that had been bound by this profound experience that they'd all suffered. And I know Judy Brett, the political scientist, historian, feels that the Second World War had a very profound effect on creating that sense of Australianness. So I think that possibly more than Curtin, although it's certainly something, Josh, that I'll want to be keeping in mind as I go through this. Both the wars, because of the way the Constitution works, in conflict, the Commonwealth gets given almost carte blanche in terms of its powers. And in the First World War, of course, we had the Anzac Legend, which came out of that and had this huge sort of nationalising effect. And the Second World War, you had the continuation of the Anzac Legend, but you had the Commonwealth launching this massive war effort when Australia seemed directly under threat. And then you get a Labor government, that launches this massive post-war reconstruction project where it starts sort of tapping on the shoulder of policies that have traditionally been the domain of the states, with its sort of ambitious, highly idealistic post-war reconstruction project that Stuart McIntyre's written about. And so, and it got control of income tax, of course, during the Second World War, all of income tax, it's never given it back. So there were these kinds of very expansive Commonwealth activities happening during the Second World War.
Carolyn, thank you so much for answering many of these questions, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. But now I'm going to invite Peter McPhee back.
Thank you. Alicia, and thanks to both of you for a terrific discussion. Carolyn, that was just wonderful. And I must say that looking at the compliments you've been receiving in the chat room, we must make a point of preserving those for you. They're really absolutely delightful and thoroughly well-deserved, and the questions were just terrific. I noticed, by the way, that several people have suggested that, given that we're living at a time when Australian athletes are still trying to claim medals that they should have won at earlier Olympics when they were running against East European athletes, that it's not too late for the Cottesloe Surf Club to insist on getting that medal back. So that could maybe be a campaign you could set up. But thank you so much.
I'll mention it to Dad.
In pre-pandemic times, we always made a point of taking our lecturer out for dinner with the board. Obviously, we're holding this lecture a day too soon. So what we're doing by way of thanking Carolyn is giving her a voucher for her to take some friends out to dinner. But thank you again very much. Now, in the minutes we have remaining, I want to begin by making a special announcement. This has to do with a new prize that's been established, the Jane Hanson Prize for History Advocacy. This is a prize that recognises the efforts of a group or an individual that's advocated for the value of history, the work of historians, and or the importance of a history education. The first time round this year, we were gratified to receive a large number of nominations of people and organisations, which are those that the History Council had in mind. People who share our commitment to the value of historical knowledge, who inspire others to share that commitment. The prize certainly seems to have been seen as a valuable recognition of great work as we hoped. The prize is named in honour of Ms. Jane Hanson, AO, whose passion for history and its advocacy is widely recognised. Through the Hanson Little Foundation, which aims to create a legacy of significant and positive change that inspires and enables Australians, Jane has provided generous philanthropic support for history and for historians in a number of organisations. I'm delighted now to announce the shortlist for the Jane Hanson Prize. Catherine Dwyer, David Waldron, Marion Littlejohn, the Melbourne Maritime Heritage Network, Richard Broome and Sue Thompson. And it's a special pleasure to be able to introduce at least to a video of Jane Hanson herself announcing the winner of the inaugural prize.
Good evening. I am delighted to announce that tonight we are awarding the inaugural Prize for History Advocacy to Sue Thompson. Sue has been an active member and long-serving president of the Lilydale and District Historical Society and of the Museum of Lilydale, now the Yarra Ranges Regional Museum. Sue has written and or coordinated the publication of approximately 40 books, walking tours and education kits for the Society. I think Sue's ongoing energy in advocating history is wonderful. As well as a respected public speaker, she has embraced current technologies to reach new audiences through two important websites. She's also been a passionate advocate of history and heritage values to the Shire of Yarra Ranges. In 2019, Sue became the local champion for the value of the history statement published by the History Councils of Australia, gaining recognition of it from the Yarra Ranges Council. So congratulations, Sue. You are an outstanding example of why I supported the establishment of this prize. As I'm sure we would all agree, it is vital to continue to raise broad awareness of the importance and relevance of history as we look to the past for answers today and guidance tomorrow. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge my dear friend, Emeritus Professor Peter McPhee. A most learned scholar and historian, Peter gives his time selflessly across many, many voluntary roles, including as chair of this council. His elegant and enthusiastic way of bringing history to life serves to educate and enlighten us all. Thank you, Peter.
It's wonderful to hear from Jane Hanson. And I'm now very happy to be able to invite Sue Thompson herself to respond to the news. Sue, please, over to you.
I'm not sure where to start. I'm a little more than a little overwhelmed at the honour that the History Council of Victoria and of course Ms. Jane Hanson has given me. I accept it on behalf of all those people throughout Victoria who actively promote the value of history in their communities. I have been very fortunate in being able to combine my two professional loves throughout my life, my love of history and journalism. Way back in the very early 60s, I had a school assignment about my family. That started my lifelong love of history. After a brief stint in the law, I found my niche in journalism, where I spent the next 40 years working with and promoting local communities and their stories. For years, the Lynn Island District Historical Society was referred to as the Hysterical Society, which was full of old people. Haven't we all heard those words? To me, there is only one way to counter that description. Be active, be innovative, and use technology to promote the value of history and its importance in our society. When in 2019 the Value of History statement was released, it was my eureka moment. It summed up to me what history is about and its role in our lives today and in the future. After gaining endorsement from the 14+ members of the Yarra Ranges Heritage Network, I made a presentation on the value of history at the Yarra Ranges Council meeting, which was referred to just before, and urged the councillors to include it in their next corporate plan as a vision statement. This request is about to be realised as the value of history statement has been added to the draft corporate plan, which will shortly be adopted by the council. However, the lobbying or advocacy doesn't stop. Over the next few years, we must continue to educate the decision makers to include the value of history in all of their decisions. For the past 2 years, Liddell Township has been undergoing massive changes with level crossing removals and millions of government dollars being spent on our infrastructure. As historians, we have to accept change, but we should always try and ensure our community's history is woven into all new projects and activities to ensure its stories are preserved and told to the present and future residents. And finally, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to Margaret Bertley, who nominated me for this award. I don't know how she did it, but she also found out things that I'd long forgotten about. So thank you again, everybody, and it's a great honour to accept this award.
Sue, that's beautifully said, and congratulations again. We're in your debt, and I think you're an admirable inaugural winner of the awards. Well done. I've now got some more very good news about another prize. So if you could bring that slide up. Thanks, Alicia. A new prize, the Lynette Russell Prize for First Peoples History in Schools. This is a prize which recognises the efforts of a group of Victorian school students in years 7 to 10 in their study of First Peoples history. The prize was established by Professor Lynette Russell AM. Lynette's the director of the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre and an ARC laureate professor. The prize is to encourage the creative engagement and deeper knowledge of a wider number of secondary school students in this area of fundamental importance to historical literacy and to an educated citizenry. We'll be calling for applications for this prize early in 2022, and we plan to announce the inaugural winner this time next year at our annual lecture. So one final point that I want to make to you, and that is that I very much hope you'll stay in touch. There are various ways you can do that, certainly through social media, but in particular, I hope that those of you who aren't yet friends, who haven't taken out membership to our friends, will think of doing so. We have lots of really terrific activities, and it's a very useful way, I think, of supporting those who are committed to the foundational importance of historical literacy in our society. So that concludes this annual lecture. I particularly want to thank Alicia Soretto, who has done a wonderful job in organising, producing this evening's occasion. Thanks to all of you, so many people, for coming, for brilliant questions and comments. And we look forward to your continuing interest and support. Goodbye.